This is Alabama Politics with Steve Flowers, an in-depth interview with Alabama's top political newsmakers. Now, from the studios of Troy University, here is Steve Flowers.
I'm Steve Flowers, and welcome to Alabama Politics. Folks, we're fortunate tonight to have as our guest one of the sharpest guys I know in Alabama on Alabama politics, Paul DeMarco. Paul is a former legislator from Jefferson County, the Homewoods area of Jefferson County, where he was born and raised, and served a long time in legislature, and is now out and is still involved in politics throughout the state. Paul, good to have you on the show.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Paul DeMarco, y'all, like I said, was born. You grew up in there in your home where you grew up?
I grew up in Birmingham, and then lived in Birmingham until I graduated, and then went to Auburn University for undergraduate school. And then
what'd you major in?
Majored in journalism, worked at the school newspaper, so I've always enjoyed.
You and Joe Bonner.
There you go. That's exactly right. So, and then after I graduated, went to University of Alabama for law school, and enjoyed my time in Auburn, enjoyed my time in Tuscaloosa.
You still practice law in Birmingham, don't you?
I do, but traveled. I've had cases in all 67 counties, and that's one of the things about the state. You know, you can, it's small enough that you can make it through the whole state, but large enough, and it's great to get to go visit all 67 counties in the state and go to the courthouses and visit with folks and friends throughout the state.
Well, people have thrown your name out as a possible constitutional candidate in the future because you're still young. You're not about 50 years old, 40 to 50 years old, are you? 53
years old.
That's you got a young family too. You started late in life getting a family.
That's right. Got a little boy, little girl, and we stay busy with sports and gymnastics and football and baseball, and we're having everything's good. Everybody's well.
But you grew up in the Homewood area, didn't you?
Actually, grew up in Birmingham, Mountain Brook, went to Auburn, Alabama, and then moved back and live in Homewood.
All right. But now, is your wife, she's from Louisiana originally?
That's exactly right. Went to school in Louisiana, went to LSU, and then moved up here to go to graduate school at Auburn, and that's how we met up here in Alabama.
Well, good. Paul DeMarco, how many years did you serve in the House?
I served almost 10 years in the House from about 2005, 2014. And the first part of my term, the Republicans were in the minority. And then starting in 2010, the Republicans in the majority. So I got to...
you came in 06?
The 05, in a special election, 05. So got to serve and see it from both perspectives. The Republicans were in the minority, and then when we took over the House in 2010. So, you know, obviously governing for being in the minority as opposed to the majority, two different ways, responsibilities, leadership in those terms when the Republicans took over after 136 years, the Democrats being in charge of the legislature.
So you served on both things. Who was the governor in 06? I forget, Bentley? Bentley came in 2000. Who was governor?
First it was Bob Riley.
In 05.
And then Robert Bentley, because I actually served with Robert Bentley
in the House.
In the House.
That's right.
So it was Bob Riley was leaving in 2010 after his had been termed a little bit out, and then that's when Robert Bentley. So it was an exciting time when Republicans took over in 2010 because there was a lot of legislation. There were a lot of issues that we wanted to take up when it was, you know, education, tort reform, budgets, ethics. So there was a lot of issues that got addressed early on in 2010 after Republicans took over.
Paul, you know, one of the things that I tell people when I served a long time in the legislature from Pike County and Dale County, people say, "What do you miss about it?" I said, "The friendships I made." I bet you probably got lifetime friends you made that came with you in 06, don't you?
That's true. A lot of folks I'd never met because I was not really involved in politics, or I had been to the State House once. I was an intern for Spencer Backus.
Yeah, Spencer and I served in the House together.
Yeah, I was a page. I guess I was a page for Spencer. That was the only time I had ever been in the State House.
When he was in legislature.
That's right. So that was the only time I had ever been in the State House before I got elected. So when I walked into the State House after I got elected, that had been the first time since I was 16 years old. because I had never spent any time in the
What
State
years
House.
would that been when you were paging for old Spence in the house? If
That-
you were 16.
That would have been in 1984, 85, 84, 85.
Spencer and I came to the house. Spencer, I think, came in a special election, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story about that. I had read in the newspaper all the legislators had gotten refrigerators in their offices. And I got mad about it. And I said, that's a waste of taxpayer money.
I remember I had one in my office. I sure
yeah,
did.
you did, didn't you? And so I called then Representative Backus and said, you know, I think that's a waste of money. Y'all putting refrigerators. He says, why don't you come spend the day and see? And I thought I was expecting to see a 7-foot refrigerator. It ended up being
little
bitty refrigerator.
We couldn't put anything in it. I don't think I ever used mine, actually, because it was so small.
But it was, so he said, see, it's not as bad as was reported in the newspaper. So anyway, so.
They thought, oh, you figured we got them big old thing from Lowe's in our office or something.
Yeah, one of those.
Palatial offices.
Exactly right, you know, refrigerators.
You know how small the offices are.
Yeah, you know, my first one, I got elected special election. It was about the size of this, a closet, not much more.
Well, let me give you some news. When I first got elected in 1982, we still met over the old House chamber, and none of us had offices. Our offices were our desk.
You know, in the almost 10 years I served in the State House, if you recall, there was a flood in either 2010 or 2011, and it flooded the basement of the State House, the current State House. Flooded, a lot of cars got flooded, and so we went across, and it was this, I think it was the last day of the session, actually met in the old House chambers, and the Senate was in the old Senate chambers.
Because of the flood.
Because of the flood. And, you know, obviously there was no computer, so they were doing the roll call votes and doing the votes. But I'll tell you, it made me really appreciate folks like you who served in the original chamber in the state capitol building and serving the history in that room. And so that's a day I'll remember. It was, like I said, I think it was the last day before we.
Did y'all meet one day there?
If I recall, it was one day, because I think it was the very last day, and this rain came and came and came.
They put y'all over in the old house
and they put us over there because we had to meet. We had to. we were running out of days, and so we couldn't just stop and say we'll come back tomorrow, because I think it was the last day, the constitutionally mandated last day, the 30th day. And so we had to meet, and we had lots of bills. As a matter of fact, I recall I had several bills that I had passed out of the House that needed to pass in the Senate. And you know, in the State House now, the Alabama House of Representatives is on the 5th floor, and the Senate's on the 7th floor. And what do you do if you're a House member? You have to go up and down the steps, up and down and up and down, to make sure your bills. It was so nice just to go across the hallway to the Senate. And
we go in, man, to each other, and had real camaraderie.
Yeah, so, and check on the status of the bill. So it was a very productive day in the sense I think I got a lot of legislation passed that I've been working on, but it was mainly just being in that historic chamber, being in the historic Senate chamber was something I'll always remember.
Yeah. Paul, you were chairman of Judiciary, weren't you?
I was, and serving as chairman of Judiciary, you know, there were obviously the two main issues that we took up were there were a lot of issues of tort reform that folks had wanted to address that had not been addressed before. But it was also, you know, our criminal justice system, and something that's near and dear to me, because I've got a lot of friends in law enforcement family who are in law enforcement and prosecutorial services, and have worked with victims' rights groups. And so the opportunity to come back and evaluate and look and work, because to me that's the number one role of government, is public safety. That is our number one role of any government, whether it's in Washington, D.C. or whether it's in Montgomery, to protect the safety of our citizens. And in some ways, you know, the state does it well. You look at the fine system we have with the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency and our state troopers, but then there are other areas that we need to really, and so that's one of those issues that we're dealing with, you know, the state's dealing with right now, is public safety.
Paul, back to the House when you got there in 2005. Who all was in the House? Just I'm not remembering the name of all of them, but who were? So was Cam Ward in the House then?
He was.
Was Carnes in there?
Yeah, that's correct. Who I had known Jim Carnes since I was in high school.
Well, he and I served together.
Right. You know, Seth Hammett was the Speaker, and there was a lot of members that were in the House that eventually moved up to the Senate. So, you know, Arthur Payne, Ron Johnson, some of those men, Alvin Holmes. Some of
we all served. I served with Alvin and Arthur and all of them.
Folks that had, you know, served there for a long time. Owen Drake from Jefferson County. So, you know, up and down, a lot of folks that I served when I got there in 2005 before a number of these folks retired or passed away.
Well, you know, Seth was considered a good speaker. He was considered fair. Don't you think he was fair to both sides?
I had an excellent working relationship. You know, I can say when I had bills that I wanted to get to the floor, Seth was a Democrat, but as a Republican, I did not have trouble getting those bills. A lot of them were local in nature, trying to reform Jefferson County. We had the issues with the steel coils that, you know, fell off the trucks. There were a lot of issues that I dealt with that I thought got a fair shake.
Paul, do you remember? I saw you there. I won't bore our viewers with this much, but you were close friends with old Joe Fuller, and Joe and I wrote a column about Joe last March. Thankfully, before he passed away, and you were there with us. I was pallbearer. I spoke at his funeral. He had helped a lot of people. Was he your political buddy?
He was a great friend, and for your listeners who are not from the Birmingham metro area, you know, Joe Fuller was an independent insurance agent, but he was more than that. He had his fingers in everything, whether it was sports-related activities. He was instrumental in helping, trying to get I-22 from Memphis through you know, Walker and went a lot of the counties up there to Birmingham. He was also engaged and wanted to have good elected officials represent the state, and so you know, you could go back and look at the history, the past 30 years. Joe Fuller knew all these elected officials and was really engaged with them. And look, he's kind of a model. We need citizens to be engaged with their elected officials, because we so much say, oh, that person's doing this or that. It's like, get engaged, know your elected officials, so you can pick up the phone and say, hey, this is what I want to see, and this isn't a reflection of the state of Alabama. And that's why a lot of folks, when they go to the legislature, they're like, there's just a disconnect there. Folks like Joe Fuller connected folks, elected officials, to the citizens, and we need more of that in Alabama today.
You know, I mentioned everybody, and I mentioned you as being one of the people he mentored or was friends with, but I watched him start Spencer Backus' campaign for Congress. I was at his house at Redmont when he called me to come to his house up in Birmingham, and I said, well, yeah. And Spencer and I have been friends in the legislature.
Yeah, and, Joe was, from everybody and anybody who was in elected office, it didn't matter whether you were a dog catcher or the governor or United States Senator. Joe had a personal relationship, and candidly, you know, we always said we were his best friend, because he had that relationship with everybody, and he's, in one sense, he is missed, but also his influence, because again, I think he wants what all of us. He just wanted good elected officials who return phone calls and were responsive to the needs of their citizens. And what more can we ask? That's
Paul,
exactly right.
He was a good man. You're out of it, but you do a lot of talking around the state and about politics, writing about it and everything. Let's review the year of 2021 as we close out 2021 and on the cusp of 2022. I'd like for you to talk about the issues of this past year, and then if we have time, maybe what would you see happening next year, the election year?
Well, obviously the pandemic has driven the headlines, and a lot of talk and concern about some of these mandates that have come down from Washington, D.C., and that, you know, unconstitutional mandates that this administration. And so I think you saw a lot of concerns from citizens about that. You know, in the legislature last session, you know, you can look at a lot of issues, some that came up, some that didn't. I think there was a lot of concern from folks about the marijuana issue that came up. You know, there were individuals that filibustered it. There were conservative Republicans that filibustered, and it passed anyway, and their concern was about the safety of citizens when it comes to this marijuana issue, safety on the roads, and looking at what's going on across the country. So there was a real concern about that. You come back this fall, you've got this special session, two of them, one of them about the prison reform. The state's going to spend $1 billion to renovate these prisons, yet the federal government, U.S. Justice Department, is saying, hey, they kind of double down on their complaints. So that's really got to be addressed. We don't want the federal government to take over. for me, the number one concern is I don't want to do anything that's going to jeopardize public safety. So I wouldn't want someone coming in and saying, okay, you're going to have to start releasing folks. Because what people need to realize is the majority of folks in the state prisons are not there for shoplifting or for minor drug, or for misdemeanors. They're there for violent felonies. And so that is the concern, and we have to make sure that our prison doors are not open. This has been an issue that's go back decades. You look at the first administration of Bob James, he was dealing with prisons. And then finally we had the issue of the reapportionment based on the 2020 census. Candidly, a lot of folks really disappointed with the legislature, the way the reapportionment committees, both in the House and the Senate, handled redistricting. The maps were released just hours to the to the public before they voted on it. And then when folks had legitimate concerns, they were not addressed. So big disappointment in the way this legislature handled redistricting, and I've heard that from folks up and down the state, from Huntsville down to Spanish Fort, Alabama.
Paul, what about, back up to the prison issue, you know, Governor Ivey, I think, was on the wrong path by trying to do the privatization. That's just my feeling, and I think most legislators were quietly thinking the same thing. But it worked out almost to, if you're going to build new prisons, they were able to get a good amount of money. I want to think several $400 million in the federal government.
Yeah, they were using both general fund money, bond issue, and then about, I think it was $400 million in COVID. Yeah. You know, I think where we are, there was debate about, well, if you lease it in 30 years, then what?
Right.
But at the end of the day, this package would include a couple of new prisons as well as renovating some of the existing prisons. And what I would say is, there's no question we need new facilities. It's interesting or ironic that some of the folks who complain the most about conditions in prisons were opposed to building new prisons. It's like, well, you can't have it both ways. You can't complain and then the state has aging facilities that need to be updated. You can't complain that they're building new prisons. But obviously there are conditions within the prison that need to be addressed. And I know the legislature's looked at, you know, raising pay of corrections facilities, but there needs to be a top to bottom look about how we handle it. Except, what I don't want to see is starting to release violent felons on the streets. And there's a real concerted effort to attack the Alabama Pardon and Parole Board right now, who's doing an excellent job. They are looking at each case on a case-by-case basis. If you remember, about 3 years ago, an individual was released, went up to Marshall County, killed 3 people. The results of that, the Attorney General, the Governor, the legislature passed legislation to reform the parole board. And because of that, they're not letting as many people out of prison. Well, they're doing it the way the reform asked, which was to look very strict, you know, look specifically at a case-by-case basis and put public safety number one. And that wasn't happening before. So we do need to watch that in the next legislative session as we get into 2022, as there are efforts to weaken the parole board.
Because that's been the issue. Alabama's not the only state that's had this Justice Department looking and say what you're doing is unconstitutional. You've got to rectify the rooms and the violence and that sort of thing in the prisons. But their remedy has been to release prisoners in California. They released a lot of prisoners, didn't they?
That's right. And so that was one of the issues in 2021. And I think the prison issue, I think everybody thought, oh, we had a special session, we approved all that money, it's over with. I think that's going to be one of the issues, that in the criminal justice system, as we deal into 2022, and those want to be one of those issues we continue to talk about in 2022.
Yeah, because it's not. We thought we'd killed it with that new prison, but obviously it's not. Well, let's move on to 2022 and the new year coming on and everything. It's an election year, and those of us who follow Alabama politics have sort of lamented the fact it's not going to be a very interesting year because of the power of incumbency, but we may have a good governor, have an interesting governor's race. There's some viable candidates challenging Governor Ivey that may get in, as this show is airing, may have already been in the race. But the big race, of course, will be the Senate race. But we're going to have our 2 top races are going to be challenged, and we'll have some legislative races around the state.
Well, and we really won't know until qualifying ends on January 28th. So qualifying begins, I believe, on January the 4th. And then I think for the Republican Party, I think Democrats maybe have actually opened it up. And then, but the last date for everyone will be January the 28th. I think it's a Friday. And look, I always said it when I was in office, until 5 o'clock, you never know what's going to happen. Because if you remember, was it 2 years ago, I believe Senator Sessions signed up or qualified on the next to last day or the last day to run for that Senate seat. So you never know what's going to happen with any of these races. You know, most folks that are serious about running have already gotten in all these races. They've already raised money. They're already crisscrossing the state of Alabama. But you may get some surprises, not only in the top races, but some of the legislative races. Sometimes people switch races. That there's precedent for that. We saw that with Governor Kay Ivey, where she originally was running for governor once and then dropped down to lieutenant governor. So there is precedent for a lot of mystery and intrigue on that last day of qualifying, and Alabama may not be any different this year in 2022.
Well, you're right. I think there'll be some surprises. But as we sit here, the best race is the U.S. Senate race, where you have Congressman Mo Brooks and from Huntsville, and then Katie Britt from the head of the Business Council of Alabama, and the war hero Michael Durant from Huntsville also, assuming that Lyndon Blanchard has moved from the Senate race to the governor's race. How do you see that race? It's going to be a very interesting race, and there'll be going to be a lot of money spent for one thing.
Well, you know, most of these folks have been in this race except for Mike Durant until they've been in for a while. What I would watch is now that once we get into 2022, I mean, the primary is in May.
All right.
And then you'll have a runoff, I believe, in June. Pretty quick turnaround this is when you'll start seeing the television advertisements. You really haven't seen a lot of television advertisements. And obviously you'll see the ads from the candidates themselves, but there'll be a lot of outside money coming in. And there'll be a lot of ads coming in from outside the state.
Right.
From all different candidates. And so that's how you kind of watch the direction of how these races will go, is how the money is kind of flowing in and how these commercials are running in and out. Obviously the candidates, if you're running a statewide race, you got to be on all the major TV networks up and down the I-65 corridor. But you can't forget the Wiregrass. You can't forget the Shoals area. You can't forget Tuscaloosa and Auburn. So right now the candidates are doing everything they can to get their name ID, but they're also raising a lot of money because once you get around to January, that's really the sprint. That's 5 months until the election. And they'll have to make a decision. Do we start getting on the air now in January, or do we wait a little bit closer? But people are watching kind of the polling. Hey, their polling's doing well. Let's contribute to them. So people want to hedge their bets. So it really is too early to call that race in the sense of we still don't know who all the players. We know some of the players, but there still may be some players. We can touch base after January 28th. Then we'll have an idea who's really is everybody in this race. And then we'll kind of have a better idea of how this race is going to play out.
You may have, if indeed the two current front runners in the race, Katie Britt and Mo Brooks, are running neck and neck, do you see a cleavage, which is not a bad thing, but a division within the Republican Party? And let me say this, the May 24th and subsequent runoff winner in June will be your senator, because the Republican primary statewide is the race. Winning the Republican primary is 10-amount election, so the May 24th and subsequent June runoff will be the race. But do you see a cleavage between what I would consider the extreme right wing of the Republican Party and the mainstream business Republicans? Is there a clear delineation in that race?
I mean, you look what's going on in Washington, D.C. I mean, folks are all over the place. And so I think that voters are really paying attention more than I think. Obviously, you look at the Trump legacy. He appointed these 3 justices, which will have, and all these judges across the country.
Right.
I mean, one of his greatest legacies is his
it will be. You're right.
To the judicial branch, and then what he did with protecting our border, what he did with national security. But I think one of the main legacies is Donald Trump is he got people engaged. He got the electorate engaged and paying attention to their elected officials. And that's what's good about that is I think people do look at candidates and do ask questions. And I'm seeing more than that than I've ever seen. Obviously, you got social media and the good and the bad that comes with that. So I think here in Alabama, we're a Republican state, But then you see some of what happens at the State House. You say, wait a second, we see more conservative legislation coming out of places like Florida or other places. So I think this Senate race, I think folks are really going to be looking at these candidates more than ever. And I think that goes back to President Trump getting people engaged in the political process.
Do you see the Durant candidacy being a viable candidate? He spends a lot of money like that?
I will give him credit. It's been a long time since I've seen somebody get in the race and spend that amount of money.
Same here.
Which is, he's doing what his folks are saying is you got to get your name ID up. You know, yeah, people remember, Black Hawk Down and remember the videos, but they haven't really associated that with someone here in Alabama. So he's doing what he has to do to get his name ID. So then once we get into 2022, we'll see if that has paid off, because the other folks, Katie Britt and Mo Brooks and Jessica Taylor, other folks have been campaigning now, Linda Blanchard, for months now. So we'll see if all this money, when they start doing some polling, once we get past the first year, you got to remember, this has been football season. People have been paying attention to football, and now it's Christmas, and then it'll be New Year's and potentially New Year's bowl games. Once we get past mid-January, then we'll have, and get past qualifying. I still want to come back to get past qualifying. I think we'll have a better idea of how these races are starting to shape.
I think you're right. We'll have an open congressional seat in the 5th for sure, because Brooks is leaving. May have other races. We'll have a lot to look forward to next year.
Yeah, there's a lot in 2022 we'll be paying attention to, not only here in Alabama, but nationally. I mean, the hopes are that Republicans will take over the House of Representatives and retake the Senate. So there's going to be a lot of policy, but a lot of elections in 2022.
Be a fun year. Well, Paul, our time's up. Folks, our guest tonight on Alabama Politics has been Paul DeMarco, a longtime figure in Alabama politics, a former legislator from Jefferson County. And we thank him for taking time out of his busy schedule to be with us. And we thank you viewers for watching. Hope you tune in again next week for Alabama Politics. Thank y'all.